That day, the atmosphere inside the Manhattan Supreme Court was so heavy that even breathing seemed to carry weight. The dark wood-paneled walls seemed to have absorbed the scent of decades of legal battles, but never before had this chamber witnessed a confrontation of such scale and consequence. On the left side of the courtroom, Richard Caldwell sat upright, his hands clasped together on the table. This man was more than just a businessman, he was a symbol of financial power in New York. As the head of Caldwell Industries, his empire spanned technology, energy, and real estate. His personal net worth, according to media estimates, exceeded $8 billion. But today, his gaze was not directed toward the public or the press. It was fixed straight ahead, on the judge's bench. On the right sat Elena Caldwell, the woman who had shared 15 years of marriage with Richard. Her brown hair was neatly tied back, her face stripped of the radiant seen in countless charity galas and project launch photos. She wore a simple navy dress with no striking jewelry. At first glance, one might assume she had resigned herself to her fate to leave the marriage with just enough settlement money to start over. But what happened next proved nothing was that simple. The trial had dragged on for 3 consecutive days. Richard's attorney, Martin Gray, a high-profile litigator with an impeccable record, repeatedly stressed that the division of assets had already been agreed upon, and there was no reason to prolong the proceedings. Elena's attorney, Robert Lane, didn't openly object, he simply took notes, requested clarifications on certain premarital assets, and held back a few undisclosed details. When Judge Margaret Sloan prepared to read the final decision, it seemed everything was already settled. Most people in the room expected the end, a mutually agreed divorce decree, a few terms on asset division and child custody, and then both parties walking out in separate directions. But at that precise moment, Elena unexpectedly leaned down, opened the handbag at her side. Her hand did not tremble, nor did she hesitate. She pulled out a folded stack of pale blue papers, slightly yellowed with age. The dry rustle of paper echoed sharply in the otherwise silent courtroom. Elena raised her head, looking directly at Judge Sloan, and spoke in a calm but clear voice. "Your Honor, this is our prenuptial agreement." The words sucked the air out of the room. Across the aisle, Martin Gray tilted his head, suspicion flashing in his eyes before giving way to a smirk. He let out a short, derisive laugh. "Your Honor, this is clearly a last-minute fabrication. Throughout these proceedings, both parties have acknowledged that no such document exists. Yet it was Richard's reaction that caught the attention of those watching closely. He didn't immediately deny it. His eyes were locked on the papers in Elena's hand. That pale blue color, he recognized it instantly. A cold, creeping sensation slid down his spine. This was the special stationery reserved exclusively for Caldwell Industries' internal documents. 15 years ago, he had used it to print a prenuptial agreement at Elena's request. But he remembered vividly, the night after their wedding, in his home office, he had burned the only existing copy of that contract in the fireplace right in front of her. The paper had turned to ash, and Elena hadn't said a word in protest. He took that as the end of all doubts, a sign that she trusted him completely. Now, what he believed had been destroyed forever was sitting there intact, complete, and bearing both signatures. Judge Sloan signaled the clerk to receive the document. The air in the courtroom grew even thicker. All eyes followed the bundle as it was carried to the bench and opened. At first glance, there was no sign of forgery. Both Richard Caldwell's and Elena Caldwell's signatures, from when she was still Elena Morgan, were clear. A witness's signature was also visible on the last page. Clause 4b. Judge Sloan read aloud, narrowing her eyes. In the event the marriage ends due to an act of profound betrayal, all assets, properties, and ownership rights acquired before the marriage shall be transferred to the wrong party. Richard shifted in his seat, his jaw tightening. He knew that clause well. He also knew that if the court deemed the document genuine and the betrayal proven, he would lose more than half of the financial power he currently held. Elena remained still, but her gaze had changed completely from the previous days. The resignation was gone, replaced by a cold, unyielding resolve. Those present that day understood one thing clearly: from this moment on, the balance of power had shifted. The courtroom emptied more slowly than usual that afternoon. Even after Judge Sloan called the recess, people lingered in the wooden pews, whispering in tight circles, glancing between Richard Caldwell's table and Elena's. The prenuptial agreement had landed like a live grenade. What should have been a procedural end to a long, draining divorce had shifted into something far more dangerous, a high-stakes legal battle where the truth, and the past 15 years, would be picked apart under a microscope. Martin Gray, Richard's attorney, was the first to recover his composure. He gathered the thick stack of files on the table in front of him and stood, addressing the bench before the judge could leave the room. "Your Honor," he said in his clipped, precise cadence, "there is absolutely no reason to believe this document is authentic. We will request immediate forensic testing of the paper, the ink, the signatures, every detail. Until then, we object to any consideration of its contents." His voice carried the confidence of a man accustomed to controlling the narrative. But for once, Richard wasn't even listening. Richard Caldwell was staring at Elena with an expression that no one in the courtroom could quite read. The lines of tension around his mouth were sharp enough to cut glass. To anyone else, the folded blue pages might have been nothing more than another piece of legal paper. But to him, they were something he knew intimately. The pale blue linen paper was custom manufactured exclusively for Caldwell Industries' internal contracts and high-level agreements. 15 years earlier, Richard had printed their prenuptial agreement on that very stock. He could still picture the conversation in his private study the night after their wedding, when he had tossed the only signed copy into the flames of the limestone fireplace. Elena had stood there, silent, watching the paper curl and blacken, until there was nothing left but ash. For him, that had been the end of it. The symbolic destruction of a contract that he'd told her would never be needed. Yet here it was again, intact, complete with his signature, her signature, and a witness's name at the bottom of the final page. And that witness, Harold Pierce, was another problem entirely. Pierce had been his second-in-command for over 20 years before disappearing from public life a decade ago. No interviews. No sightings. His name scrubbed from every corporate record after his sudden resignation. Richard knew exactly why. Across the aisle, Elena was unshaken. She had not moved since the recess was called. While the courtroom murmured, she sat perfectly still, eyes fixed on Richard, not in anger, not in triumph, but with a steady, measuring calm. Robert Lane, her attorney, rose slowly, waiting for Gray to finish. His approach was deliberate, his tone low and almost conversational when he addressed Judge Sloan. "Your Honor," he began, "there is a chain of custody for this document. My client will provide supporting materials that confirm its authenticity. Furthermore, there is evidence separate from the document that will demonstrate why Clause 4B applies in this case." He didn't elaborate. Lane wasn't showing all his cards, and everyone in the room could feel it. Richard suddenly broke in, his voice louder than intended. "Elena, what are you trying to do here? You destroy my life, this company over that?" Every head turned. Elena's response was quiet, measured, and immediate. "Not over that, Richard. Over the truth." The words hit with a force that no raised voice could match. Judge Sloan tapped her pen against the bench, breaking the moment. "We will adjourn for 3 days to allow both parties to prepare and to arrange for expert examination of the document. Be advised, if it is proven genuine, and if the conditions of Clause 4B are met, this court will have no choice but to enforce the agreement in full." Her tone left no room for misinterpretation. Richard's entire portfolio of premarital assets, real estate, shares, intellectual property would be transferred to Elena if the betrayal clause was triggered. The sound of chairs scraping against the floor filled the room as people began to file out. Richard didn't look at Elena. He was already on his phone, his voice low but urgent, issuing instructions to someone on the other end. His movements were quick, controlled, but there was an edge of urgency beneath them. Elena walked toward the exit with Lane. She didn't rush. Halfway down the aisle, she allowed herself the faintest trace of a smile, one so slight that anyone not watching closely would have missed it. It was the smile of someone who had just shifted the terrain of the battlefield. Outside the courthouse, the November air was brittle and cold. The crowd of onlookers and reporters surged toward the steps, shouting questions, their cameras flashing. Gray shielded Richard, steering him toward a waiting black sedan. Lane and Elena exited by a side door, avoiding the press entirely. Inside the car, Richard called a second number. "We need everything on Harold Pierce addresses, phone records, banking, whatever's left. I don't care how old it is. And get someone on Lane. I want to know what else they have." His driver kept his eyes on the road, but the tension in the car was palpable. Richard wasn't just reacting to a legal challenge, he was reacting to a threat that came from deep inside his own history. For Elena, the next 72 hours would be a calculated wait. She knew the document's authenticity could be attacked, but she also knew Lane had anticipated that. There was more in their possession: records, letters, financial trails that tied directly back to the moment the agreement was signed. And there was Harold Pierce. If they could find him, and if he would talk, the case would shift from one woman's word against her husband's to a verifiable account supported by an original witness. Back in her apartment, Elena reviewed a folder Lane had handed her on the way out of court. Inside were photocopies of documents she had stored for years, some connected to the prenup, others to Richard's business dealings in the early years of their marriage. She knew the contents intimately. She also knew that every one of them carried a weight Richard would rather see buried. The fight was no longer about alimony, property division, or even the divorce itself. It had become something larger, a struggle over who controlled the story of their life together and who would walk away holding the truth. For 15 years, Richard Caldwell had been the unassailable face of Caldwell Industries, decisive, charismatic, untouchable. But the appearance of those blue pages had opened a crack in that facade, and Elena was ready to widen it. 3 days. That was all the time either side had before the next confrontation. And both of them understood something that no one else in the courthouse that afternoon could fully grasp. The war had only just begun. For the next 72 hours, Richard Caldwell's legal team moved like a machine built for one purpose: dismantling whatever Elena had placed on that table. From the moment Judge Sloan adjourned the hearing, Martin Gray assembled a small army document examiners, forensic handwriting experts, even specialists in the chemical dating of ink. On the surface, it was a procedural response. In reality, it was a scramble, because buried somewhere beneath Richard's practiced composure was the knowledge that the prenup was real. And if it was real, then the name scrawled beneath the words "witness signature Harold Pierce" would be the key to either cementing its legitimacy or burning it to ash. Harold Pierce was not a man easy to find. 10 years earlier, he had been more than Richard's chief operating officer. He had been his confidant, a man who knew every detail of Caldwell Industries' rapid rise. Harold had been present at mergers, acquisition negotiations, and private boardroom deals that never made it to the press. His departure from the company was abrupt, announced in a 2-sentence press release that mentioned irreconcilable differences and personal pursuits. Within months, Harold had disappeared from public view entirely. In the conference room of Lane and Foster LLP, Elena sat across from Robert Lane and his junior associate, Dana Ruiz. Spread between them were 2 folders, one containing the prenup, the other holding what little they knew of Harold's post-Caldwell life. Dana tapped a page listing known addresses. Last known residence, Stamford, Connecticut, sold in 2015. Then a P.O. box in Boston for 3 years. That's it. Robert leaned back, eyes on Elena. If we can find him and he confirms the signature, this isn't just leverage, it's the foundation of your entire case. Elena nodded. He'll remember. Harold, he wasn't like Richard. He believed in things. Principles. Robert didn't reply, but he had read the corporate memos from Harold's final months. They hinted at conflict, at deals Harold had refused to sign off on. Richard's way of solving that had been to push him out, quietly and permanently. Meanwhile, Richard's side was working the same angle, only faster. In a glass-walled conference room at Gray & Associates, Martin Gray stood over a city map littered with pins and sticky notes. His investigator, Calvin Briggs, pointed to one in upstate New York. He's here. Or at least, someone matching his description: his small cabin, no neighbors for half a mile. He pays cash for everything. No utilities in his name. But the car matches his old registration, a green Ford pickup, 2008 model. Richard leaned over the table. How soon can we get to him? Tonight, Briggs replied. But I need to know, are we talking friendly persuasion, or the kind that leaves no paper trail? Richard's jaw tightened. Make him remember where his loyalties lie. By the next morning, Elena and Robert had their own lead. Dana had dug into corporate filings from Caldwell Industries dating back 15 years and found something overlooked: a small land parcel in Ulster County transferred from the company to Harold Pierce as a bonus in 2010. The deed was in Harold's name, but the tax filings showed sporadic payments, sometimes late, sometimes in lump sums. That's where he'll be, Dana said. If you wanted to disappear but keep something of value, this is the perfect place. They set out that afternoon. But by the time they reached the winding gravel road leading to the cabin, a different vehicle had already been there, a black SUV with tinted windows. The tire tracks were fresh, the gravel still shifted for movement. Robert stepped out first, scanning the tree-line. No signs of life, no smoke from the chimney. The cabin door was locked, but not freshly. It had the look of a place someone had left in a hurry. Inside, the air smelled faintly of coffee and wood smoke. There were 2 mugs on the counter, one still damp at the bottom. A half-read newspaper lay on the table, dated that very morning. Whoever had been here had left within hours. Elena picked up a folded piece of paper near the sink. It was an envelope with no stamp, just her name on the front in neat handwriting. Inside, a single line. Don't look for me. It's not safe for either of us. No signature, but the handwriting was unmistakable. Robert took the note from her hands. They got to him first. They left the cabin, but Elena couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The forest around them was silent, too silent. On the drive back, Robert made a call to a contact in New York, instructing them to discreetly monitor all Caldwell-related legal activity. That evening, in her rented townhouse, Elena found another envelope slipped under the door. No handwriting this time, just a typed note. Drop the prenup. This is your only warning. There was no signature, but the implication was clear. Richard had decided to fight not just in the courtroom but in every shadow he could reach. The next morning, Robert's investigator uncovered something else. In the weeks before Harold's disappearance from Caldwell Industries, a set of internal memos had circulated about pre-existing personal obligations. The phrasing was vague, but tied to a financial structure called the Phoenix Trust. Robert suspected it was connected to Richard's past, possibly something Harold had been witness to. If the prenup was one lever, this trust could be another. But without Harold, proving any of it would be near impossible. Elena knew one thing for certain: Richard had underestimated her resolve. He believed she would fold under pressure, the way she had so many times before in their marriage. What he didn't understand was that fear, once burned away, doesn't grow back the same way. She wasn't fighting for half of his empire anymore. She was fighting for the truth, and for the right to tell it. The hunt for Harold Pierce had just begun, but already, the lines between legal strategy and personal war were blurring. In Manhattan's highest courts, battles are fought with evidence, precedents, and motions. In Richard Caldwell's world, they were fought with intimidation, isolation, and silence. Elena intended to meet him on both fronts. By the end of that week, Elena had learned something about her husband's empire that she had never truly understood while she was married to him. Its strength didn't come from the size of its assets, but from the invisibility of its secrets. Richard's real currency was control of people, of information, of perception. And now, with the prenup in play, every piece of that control was being turned against her. Robert Lane's office was buried under folders, printouts, and digital drives. The focus had shifted from finding Harold Pierce to chasing something Richard would never expect her to find: the Phoenix Trust. Robert suspected it wasn't just an obscure financial instrument, it was a vault for something Richard wanted buried so deeply that even his own board might not know about it. The first lead came not from an accountant or a banker, but from Dana Ruiz, the junior associate who had a knack for connecting seemingly irrelevant dots. She'd spent 2 days cross-referencing Caldwell Industries' SEC filings with land and property transfers in multiple states. Hidden among thousands of pages of corporate data was a series of small, irregular payments, 5 figures at most, made to a shell corporation in Delaware with no listed employees. The name of that entity, Crownfield Holdings. Dana pointed at the screen. Look at the dates. Every transfer happens in May, within 2 weeks of Richard's wedding anniversary. And in the second year of your marriage, the amount jumps from $50,000 to $200,000, then stays high. Elena stared at the figures. That's when I miscarried. Robert frowned. If the payments are tied to a personal event, that strengthens our theory. But we still don't know what Crownfield Holdings is beyond a name. They decided to pull incorporation records. As expected, the listed officer was a professional proxy, someone paid to sign documents without knowing the real owners. But the address on the initial filing wasn't a law firm or P.O. box. It was a luxury apartment building in Boston. And the leaseholder for that apartment, 5 years ago, had been a woman named Catherine Powell. Robert leaned back in his chair. This is it. She's the link. If we can find her, we might find the key to the trust. Elena felt an unease she couldn't quite name. And if she doesn't want to be found? Robert didn't look away. Then we have to convince her. One way or another, she's part of the same story now. While they worked, Richard's camp had gone on the offensive. Within 48 hours, gossip blogs began circulating stories about Elena's spending habits, her supposed emotional instability, and an unverified claim that she'd had an affair with a European art dealer 3 years ago. None of it was true, but truth wasn't the point, it was noise, meant to weaken her credibility before the hearing. The pressure wasn't just public. That Friday evening, as Elena was leaving her rented townhouse, she noticed a black sedan parked 2 houses down. It was still there when she returned 2 hours later. The same car appeared again outside Robert Lane's office the next morning. No one approached her, no one spoke, but the message was clear. Robert advised her to change her routines, vary her routes, and keep her phone on at all times. He also made another suggestion, one that told Elena just how seriously he was taking Richard's tactics. We should put everything we find in multiple safe locations, Robert said. Not just the prenup, but anything connected to Crownfield or the Phoenix Trust. Assume they'll try to destroy it. That afternoon, they began scanning, duplicating, and securing every document. One set went into a safety deposit box under Robert's name. Another went to a trusted contact in Washington, D.C. The originals were kept in a fireproof case in Robert's private storage unit. The breakthrough came from an unexpected angle. Dana tracked down a public grant application Catherine Powell had submitted to an arts foundation 6 years earlier. In the supporting documents, Catherine had listed her sources of income, including an educational trust that matched the structure of the Phoenix Trust. The beneficiary of that trust was a boy named Leo Powell. Elena stared at the name. She has a child. Dana's voice was low. If the trust is tied to him, and Richard is involved, we may be looking at a secret that qualifies as the profound personal betrayal clause in your prenup. Robert was cautious. We can't accuse without proof. But if Richard is Leo's father, that's not just infidelity, it's a concealment that could shift the entire asset division. They made the decision to approach Catherine directly, not through subpoenas or formal letters that Richard's lawyers could intercept. Robert used an investigator with a background in skip tracing to locate her in Hartford, Connecticut. She taught art classes part-time and sold hand-painted ceramics online under a pseudonym. When Elena and Robert arrived, Catherine didn't seem surprised to see them. Her small home was warm, filled with canvases and brushes. Photos of a dark-haired boy decorated the shelves at the park, holding a soccer ball, laughing in a kitchen. They sat in the living room, an awkward silence stretching until Catherine spoke first. "I've been expecting this," she said. "I thought it would happen years ago." Elena kept her voice calm. "We're not here to hurt you. But I believe Richard has used you, the same way he's used me, to protect himself." Catherine's eyes flicked to Robert, then back to Elena. "He told me if I ever spoke to you, or anyone connected to you, he'd cut off the trust. Not just for me, he said he'd make sure Leo never had a future." Robert leaned forward. The trust is funded through Caldwell Industries, correct? We can protect it if you're willing to testify. Catherine hesitated, looking toward the hallway where a closed bedroom door stood. Leo doesn't know. He just thinks his father is gone. If this comes out, it'll change everything for him. Elena's tone softened. Catherine, he's already shaped everything about your life and mine. The difference is, now you have a choice in how the truth comes out. In court, under protection, or in whispers controlled by Richard. For a long moment, Catherine said nothing. Then she stood, walked to a small desk, and returned with a folder. Inside were copies of the trust documents, along with a birth certificate listing no father. This is all I have, she said. But it's enough to prove what he did. If it means Leo gets to choose his own identity when he's older, I'll do it. Elena nodded, feeling the weight of the moment. This wasn't just evidence, it was the turning point in a war Richard thought he was winning. By the time they drove back to Manhattan, Robert already had a plan for how to introduce Catherine's testimony without tipping their hand too early. But Elena knew that once Richard saw her in the courtroom, he would understand immediately. And when that happened, the real fight would begin. The Monday of the resumed hearing arrived like a storm front, thick, heavy, and impossible to ignore. Outside the Manhattan Supreme Court, the sidewalk buzzed with reporters, each trying to read the body language of the two key players before they even entered the building. Richard Caldwell arrived first, stepping out of a black town car flanked by Martin Gray and two junior associates. His suit was immaculate, his jaw clenched. If he felt pressure, he masked it with the same practiced composure that had served him in boardrooms for decades. Elena arrived 10 minutes later with Robert Lane. She wore the same understated navy dress she had chosen for the first day of the hearing, a deliberate choice: control the image, deny the opposition anything to spin. There was no grand statement to the cameras, no smile for the flashes. Only a steady walk through the courthouse doors, as if she were stepping into a place she belonged. Inside, Judge Sloan wasted no time. We will reconvene, she said, to address the authenticity of the prenuptial agreement presented by Mrs. Caldwell and to hear any evidence relevant to its enforcement. Martin Gray rose first, delivering a performance that was equal parts confidence and aggression. He presented two handwriting experts, both claiming the signature on Elena's document was a forgery. He called a paper analyst who insisted that the chemical composition of the ink didn't match what was commonly used in 2010. He even introduced an affidavit from a former Caldwell Industries security manager stating that no such document had ever been stored in the company's archives. To anyone unfamiliar with Richard's reach, the display might have seemed convincing. But Elena knew better. Every expert on that stand could have been paid, coached, or intimidated into their testimony. When Robert's turn came, he did not immediately call a counter-expert on handwriting or ink. Instead, he walked to the evidence table and laid out two documents side by side. This, he said, holding up the first, is the prenuptial agreement in question. And this, he continued, lifting the second, is a letter dated August 3, 2010, from Richard Caldwell to the Board of Trustees at the Soho Gallery donating $2 million in his wife's name for a research fellowship. The courtroom murmured. Robert didn't raise his voice, but his words carried. Both are printed on the same pale blue linen blend paper, custom ordered for Caldwell Industries' internal and confidential correspondence. Paper that was never sold commercially and manufactured in only one batch in 2009. If my learned colleague wishes to claim forgery, he must explain how my client also forged a piece of paper Caldwell himself submitted to a public institution. Gray was on his feet instantly. Objection irrelevant. Sustained in part, Judge Sloan said, but I will allow the witness to continue if he can connect this directly to the case at hand. Robert smiled slightly. Your Honor, the connection is this: if the paper is authentic, and it was in my client's possession since 2010, the burden shifts. Mr. Caldwell must explain why a document he claims never existed is printed on the same stock as one of his own authenticated letters. It was a small crack in Richard's wall, but enough to let Robert push further. I'd like to call our next witness, he said. Catherine Powell. The name meant nothing to most in the room except Richard. For the first time that morning, he lost his composure. His head turned sharply toward the double doors as they opened and Catherine walked in. She was calm, deliberate, dressed simply but without hesitation in her step. Under oath, Catherine confirmed her identity and her prior residence in Boston. She explained her connection to Crownfield Holdings and the Phoenix Trust. Her voice did not waver when she stated, plainly, that the trust was established by Richard Caldwell in the months following his marriage to Elena. The beneficiary was her son, Leo Powell, whom she identified as Richard's biological child. The gallery behind them erupted into whispers. Judge Sloan called for order. Martin Gray launched into cross-examination, attacking Catherine's credibility, suggesting she was motivated by money, by spite, by promises from Elena. But Catherine anticipated every angle. She produced copies of the trust documents, showing Caldwell's name as the grantor and the payments made each year. She explained how the trust had been structured to appear as an educational endowment, masking its true purpose. Finally, Robert guided her to the key point. "Miss Powell, were you ever told by Mr. Caldwell to conceal the fact that he was Leo's father?" "Yes," Catherine said. "He told me if I ever revealed it to anyone he'd cut off the trust and use his influence to make sure I could never find work again." In the silence that followed, Robert turned to the judge. "Your Honor, the prenuptial agreement clearly states that in the event of profound personal betrayal, including but not limited to infidelity, all premarital assets revert to the betrayed spouse. Concealing a child from the lawful spouse, funding that concealment through a complex trust, and threatening the child's mother, these are actions that fit the clause's definition beyond question." Gray protested, demanding a recess, claiming they'd been ambushed with inadmissible testimony. But the judge didn't immediately grant it. Instead, she addressed Richard directly for the first time. "Mr. Caldwell," Judge Sloan said, "you may wish to confer with your counsel. I am strongly inclined to find this agreement enforceable." What happened next was less a legal argument and more a slow collapse of a fortress. Gray's strategy shifted from denial to damage control. He hinted at settlement, floated offers behind closed doors, tried to chip away at the scope of what Elena would receive. But Elena refused to negotiate. She didn't just want assets, she wanted the full execution of the document. 3 days later, Judge Sloan delivered her ruling. The prenup was valid. The betrayal clause had been triggered. Elena Caldwell would receive all assets Richard had owned before their marriage, effectively removing control of Caldwell Industries from his hands. Full control of the Phoenix Trust would transfer to her as trustee. The gavel fell. The case was over. Richard sat frozen, his eyes fixed on some distant point beyond the courtroom. Catherine exhaled quietly, almost in disbelief. Robert began gathering his files. Elena remained still for a moment, absorbing the reality not just of what she had won, but of what she had survived. Outside, reporters swarmed, eager for statements. Elena said nothing beyond one sentence. "Truth is the only thing he couldn't buy." The ruling echoed far beyond the walls of the Manhattan Supreme Court. By the time Elena Caldwell stepped into the cold late winter air, the verdict was already flashing across financial networks, dissected on legal blogs, and gossiped about in every major media outlet. Some called it the Caldwell coup, others the prenup power play, but beneath the headlines, the truth was simpler. Richard Caldwell had lost control of his empire in a single courtroom decision, and the blow had come from inside his own household. The next morning, Caldwell Industries stock opened 18% lower, erasing $1.6 billion in market value within the first hour. Shareholders demanded an emergency board meeting. In the sleek Midtown headquarters, panic mingled with disbelief. Richard Caldwell's name, once shorthand for stability, had become a liability. Leaked minutes from that tense boardroom meeting revealed the mood: we need to separate the man from the company. The market's already done that. She owns 51%. There's no separating anything without her consent. Elena's sudden majority stake meant she could dictate governance, hire or fire executives, and veto strategic moves. In practical terms, she now wielded more power over Caldwell Industries than Richard ever had, unburdened by the personal loyalties and shadowy backroom arrangements that had long constrained him. Within 2 weeks, she used that power to order an independent audit of all subsidiaries and shell entities, a move that sent a chill through corridors where questionable accounting had been an accepted way of doing business. Richard, meanwhile, withdrew to his penthouse, vanishing from public life. His calls to political and financial allies were met with polite sympathy but no offers of help. No one wanted to take on a fight already decided in court, especially one sealed by Judge Sloan's meticulous ruling. The press began peeling back the layers of his career deals skirting legality, offshore accounts, patterns of silencing former associates through legal threats. Each revelation chipped away at his influence, accelerating his decline. By summer, 2 federal agencies had launched investigations into the creation of the Phoenix Trust and the corporate structures used to hide it. Elena had not initiated these inquiries, but when approached, her team quietly cooperated. For Catherine Powell, the court's decision was more than financial relief, it was the lifting of a decade-long silence. The trust, now under Elena's stewardship, no longer came with the unspoken gag order Richard had enforced. Catherine's son, Leo, too young to understand the full story, could finally grow up without the weight of a hidden identity. 3 weeks after the ruling, Elena traveled to Boston to meet Catherine and Leo in a quiet neighborhood park. Witnesses later said it was like 2 soldiers after the same war, marked less by celebration than by mutual understanding. "I can't undo the years," Elena told her softly, "but I can make sure he doesn't control the years ahead." The media turned Elena into an unlikely symbol, part cautionary tale, part folk hero. Some hailed her as the woman who outplayed a titan, others labeled her cold and calculating. She refused interviews, avoiding narratives that would reduce her 15-year marriage to a single victory. Investigative reporters pieced together a fuller portrait. Elena Morgan, an art history scholar turned philanthropist, who had once believed in the man she married. The prenuptial agreement, they noted, was not a grab for wealth but a safeguard for mutual respect. It was Richard's choice to violate that principle that brought him down. Her only public statement, delivered through her attorney, was concise: this was never about wealth. It was about the value of honesty and the cost of deception. Behind the scenes, few knew how deliberate Elena's moves had been. Withholding the prenup until the decisive moment wasn't an impulsive strike, it was a calculated maneuver to force Richard onto the defensive before he could discredit her. Robert Lane, her attorney, later admitted off the record that the most difficult task had been gathering evidence without alerting Richard's network of private investigators. The discovery of the Soho Gallery letter had been pivotal, but Catherine's testimony had sealed the outcome. Paper is evidence, Lane reflected, but people, they're the ones who can sink or save you. Judge Margaret Sloan's decision became one of the most cited family law rulings of the decade. Her opinion defined profound personal betrayal as encompassing not just infidelity but deliberate deception of life-altering magnitude, setting a precedent for prenuptial enforcement. She declined interviews, but her reputation for control and impartiality only grew. One former clerk remarked, "She presided over a financial hurricane and never let the wind move her." Months later, Richard made one last attempt to strike back, filing a civil suit accusing Elena of malicious interference in corporate governance. It never went to trial. Faced with her counterclaims and the weight of incriminating evidence, he withdrew, settling quietly under undisclosed terms. Those close to him say he now drifts between private residences in Florida and the Caribbean, never staying long enough to draw attention. His name still carries a faint echo of influence, but the Caldwell empire, as it once existed, is gone. 2 years after the trial, Caldwell Industries had stabilized under leaders chosen by Elena. The company restructured, shedding opaque subsidiaries and launching philanthropic programs in education and the arts. For the first time in decades, the annual report listed corporate ethics as a core value. Whether that was genuine reform or strategic PR remained up for debate. Elena returned to academia, funding art history fellowships and supporting nonprofits that assist women in high-conflict divorces. She turned down book deals and documentaries. Catherine moved into a larger home in Boston's suburbs, where Leo thrived at school. His surname remained Powell, though Elena ensured the option to change it was always there. The prenup, once a flashpoint in a bitter marriage, now rested in a climate-controlled archive. No longer a weapon, it had become a relic, a reminder that this war had been won not through force or fortune, but through patience, precision, and an unshakable refusal to be silenced. As one financial editorial observed, Richard Caldwell built an empire on control. Elena Caldwell dismantled it with the one thing he underestimated: her resolve. By the third spring after the trial, the Caldwell case had faded from headlines, but not from the lives it had reshaped. Public attention shifted to new scandals, celebrity divorces, political downfalls, corporate collapses, yet the ripples from Elena Caldwell's quiet war against her husband still touched the edges of New York's financial and legal worlds. For Elena, the absence of cameras was a relief. Her days no longer revolved around strategy meetings, depositions, or the carefully timed release of evidence, but victory had left her with an uncomfortable inheritance: the remnants of Richard's empire. Even stripped of its opacity and its most questionable actors, Caldwell Industries remained a behemoth. She hadn't wanted to run it, yet ownership made stepping away impossible. The independent audit she ordered in her first weeks of control had concluded months earlier, producing a 412-page report cataloging every irregularity, from minor accounting violations to transactions skirting the edge of criminality, many relics from Richard's era, buried in offshore entities, subsidiaries with no employees but substantial cash flow, and charitable foundations functioning as personal expense accounts. Some matters she handled quietly, shutting down inactive shells, reimbursing misappropriated funds, moving assets back onshore, while others went directly to regulators, each disclosure carrying a cost to both the company's image and her own. It was a strange inversion. The very power she had fought to secure now demanded that she dismantle parts of what she had won. One unresolved thread tugged at her thoughts: Harold Pierce, the witness to the original prenup, had never resurfaced. His absence during the trial had been explained as unavailable, with no detail, and Robert Lane authenticated the contract without him, relying on handwriting analysis, corporate stationery records, and a retired paralegal's statement. Still, Elena wondered whether Pierce's disappearance was loyalty to Richard, fear, or something more. In early April, she received an unmarked envelope at her foundation's office. Inside was a single sheet of paper, folded twice, with a note in neat block letters: "I left because I knew what would happen if I stayed. You did the right thing. That's all that matters. HP." No return address, no further contact. She locked it away with the original prenup and the Soho Gallery correspondence, unsure if it was closure or a warning. While Elena's life became defined by reform and quiet philanthropy, Richard's had shrunk into something smaller, quieter, and almost invisible. Thinner, paler, and quicker to anger, he drifted between residences in Florida and the Caribbean, rarely staying more than a month. His days were split between golf, long calls with old associates, and meetings with boutique advisors managing the remnants of his fortune. Though free from criminal charges, ongoing federal inquiries into Caldwell-era transactions kept him tethered to attorneys. He had settled the malicious interference lawsuit against Elena under confidential terms, but in private avoided saying her name. In his remaining circles, some speculated about a return under a new banner or in a foreign market, but pragmatists knew there was no outrunning the record of such a public fall. For Catherine Powell, the years after the trial brought slow relief from a decade of tension. With the Phoenix Trust under Elena's control, financial support for her son Leo was secure and free from Richard's conditions. At 9, tall for his age and endlessly curious, Leo knew only the basics that his father had once been involved, but living apart was better. Catherine knew he would someday read the court records and the internet's harsher truths, but for now, she let him grow without their shadow. She and Elena kept occasional contact, not friends, but allies shaped by the same adversary conversations, drifting between mundane updates and the quiet recognition of survival. Under leadership appointed by Elena, Caldwell Industries transformed beyond recognition. Entire divisions were sold or spun off, others were restructured to meet transparency standards Richard would have dismissed. Shareholder meetings now included open can-day sessions, and corporate ethics appeared as a section header in annual reports. Financial cynics debated whether the changes were sincere or clever PR, but even they admitted the tone had shifted. Richard's old allies grumbled about the loss of the Caldwell edge, while others adapted, finding new opportunities in the rebranded company. Despite the appearance of resolution, Elena knew her victory hadn't erased the past. Richard still lived, his diminished network still breathing, and though she had no desire for open conflict, she remained vigilant. One late evening, as she left her office, Robert Lane called. His voice was calm but carried caution. "We've been contacted by a journalist. Someone claims to have internal Caldwell Industries memos from during your marriage. They want to meet." She asked if they'd said what was in them. "No," he replied, "only that it changes the narrative." Standing in the quiet hallway, Elena felt the familiar stirrings of the past, knowing in Richard's world, loose ends never dangled without purpose. But unlike before, she no longer faced them from dependency or fear. "Set the meeting," she said. It wasn't a declaration of war, but neither was it retreat. Some battles, she knew, didn't end with a ruling, they simply went underground, waiting for the next move.